They say grief is a fog. For me, it was a lens. My husband was dead. But before the first clod of dirt even settled on his expensive coffin, his own children were already trying to bury me right alongside him. They thought a grieving widow, a 73-year-old woman, was an easy target, a loose end to be tied up. They had no idea that for 50 years I had been watching, listening, and learning. They had no idea I was about to unearth a family secret so dark it would burn their entire world to the ground. You won't believe what I found in my own basement. Make sure you follow, like, and hit that notification bell, because this is one inheritance story that ends in fire and ashes. My name is Elizabeth Sterling. The damp, rich soil from my husband Robert's grave was still clinging to the sensible black heels I'd chosen for the occasion. It felt like the only real thing in the entire universe. That, and the cold ache in my back. I stood in the grand foyer of the house he built, a place he never once called a home. It was his monument, his cathedral of ego, all gleaming Italian marble and soaring vaulted ceilings that seemed to echo with a hollow, mocking laughter. The air was thick and cloying, a suffocating mixture of lilies, and more lilies, their funereal scent mingling with the stale, performative grief of distant relatives I hadn't seen in a decade. They milled around, sipping Robert's finest whiskey and murmuring platitudes, their eyes darting around, calculating the value of the art, the Persian rugs, the grand piano silent in the corner. My son David stood near the massive double doors, his face a blotchy, puffy mask of a sorrow he clearly didn't feel. He was accepting condolences with a practiced solemnity, shaking hands, patting shoulders. He had his father's height, his father's tailored suit, but none of his steel. Robert would have despised this display of weakness. But my attention wasn't on David. It was on his wife, Chloe. She moved through the crowd like a sleek black panther, her designer dress clinging to her gym-honed figure, a stark, predatory shadow against the muted tones of mourning. She finally drifted towards me, a shark scenting blood in the water. She leaned in close, her hair smelling of expensive salon products tickling my cheek. Her breath was a cloud of champagne from the wake, a celebration, not a commiseration. "Elizabeth," she whispered, her voice a venomous conspiratorial hiss wrapped in the guise of comfort. "Darling, I'm so sorry for your loss, but we need to be practical. Cha." Her perfectly manicured hand rested on my arm, the nails painted a deep blood red. "We need to get the lawyers moving on the inheritance. First thing tomorrow. We need to speed things up. I'm putting a non-refundable deposit down on the new penthouse this afternoon." The words didn't just land. They detonated. A deposit. A non-refundable one. While her father-in-law's body was barely hours in the ground, while the casseroles from well-meaning neighbours were still warm in the kitchen, she was carving up the spoils. Spending the money. My money. His money. It was all a blur of assets and portfolios to them. A cold, hard clarity sharp as a shard of broken glass cut through the fog of what I was supposed to be feeling. Grief, sadness, loss. What I felt was the sudden, shocking snap of chains that had been wrapped around me for half a century. I looked around the vast, impersonal foyer. I saw the portraits of Robert stern and commanding. I saw the heavy, opulent furniture he'd chosen, the colours he'd dictated. I had been a prisoner in this house for 50 years. Robert was the warden, a meticulous, controlling tyrant who disguised my cage with gold leaf and silk curtains. And now, it was sickeningly clear that his successors, his own flesh and blood, had not only been chosen, but were eagerly stepping up to take his place. They weren't just planning to take the house. They were planning to dispose of its last remaining inmate. Me. Later that evening, After the last of the weeping relatives and calculating business partners had departed, leaving behind a wake of half-empty glasses and crumbs of canapes, the house fell into a deep, unnerving silence. It was a silence I knew well, but for the first time it didn't feel lonely. It felt charged. David was a ghost of his father, a pale imitation. He possessed Robert's towering ambition, but was utterly devoid of his cunning, his patience, his brutal efficiency. He approached me as I sat in Robert's oversized leather armchair in the study, a room I was seldom welcome in when he was alive. The chair still smelled faintly of him cigar smoke and expensive cologne. David fidgeted with the diamond-studded cuffs of his ridiculously expensive suit, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. A habit Robert relentlessly mocked. "Mom!" He began, his voice strained, avoiding my eyes. He stared at a point somewhere over my left shoulder. "Chloe and I were thinking, we've been talking, and we're worried about you." A lie. The first of many. "This house. It's just too big for you now. The upkeep alone, the stairs. It's a lot for one person to manage." He was trying to sound gentle, concerned. It came across as condescending and rehearsed. He slid a glossy trifold brochure across the polished mahogany surface of the desk, pushing it towards me as if it were a peace offering. The cover was a photo of a serene, silver-haired couple laughing as they played chess in a sun-drenched garden. The title, in a soft, elegant font, read, "The Willows, a Premier Assisted Living Community." Premier, assisted, community. Every word was a euphemism. It was a prison with softer chairs, a waiting room for the end of the line. "It's top-tier mom, the best. 24-hour nursing staff, gourmet meals, social activities. You'd be safe there, cared for, safe." I'd never been safe in my life. I'd been controlled. I opened the brochure. The people inside were all smiling, their expressions vacant, their eyes empty. They were posed in sterile, brightly lit rooms, playing bingo, doing watercolor painting, participating in gentle yoga. It was a portrait of a life scrubbed clean of all personality, all sharp edges, all freedom. "We could sell the house." He continued, his voice gaining a desperate, almost pleading edge. This was the real point. The prelude was over. "Dad's portfolio it's complex. A lot of it is tied up in assets that are hard to move. Liquidating the main asset, the house, it would simplify things. Tremendously. For all of us. For all of us." He meant for him and Chloe, for their penthouse dreams, and God knows what else. I looked at my son, this strange man standing before me, a man I had birthed, a man I had raised, and I felt a profound and chilling disconnect. I didn't recognize him. His eyes, the same shade of blue as his father's, didn't hold a shred of genuine concern for my well-being. They were filled with the frantic, shifting calculations of a desperate gambler about to lose everything. I remembered how Robert had always belittled him, calling him weak, indecisive, a disappointment. "He doesn't have the stomach for it," Robert used to say about business, about life. And now here David was trying to prove he had the stomach for it after all. He was trying to step into his father's colossal shoes, and his first big move, his first act of decisive masculine power, was to dispose of his own mother. To pack me away in a box, like a piece of old, unwanted china. I said nothing. For 5 decades, silence had been my only refuge, my only weapon in a war I couldn't openly fight. Robert's booming voice had filled every corner of this house, every moment of our lives. My silence was the only space that was truly my own. It was a shield and a tool. It made people uncomfortable. It made them fill the void with their own anxieties, their own guilt. And it unnerved David, just as it had always unnerved his father. He shifted his weight from one expensive shoe to the other. His Adam's apple bobbed. He wanted me to argue, to cry, to plead. He was prepared for that. He had his script, his pre-packaged, compassionate-sounding rebuttals. He was not prepared for the void. He was not prepared for me to simply look at him, my gaze level and unblinking, letting his own pathetic, greedy words hang in the air between us, rotting. Finally, unable to bear it, he cleared his throat. Just think about it, Mum. He left the glossy brochure on the table, a threat disguised as a kindness, a death sentence presented as a gift. He turned and fled the room, leaving me alone with the ghost of his father, and the dawning of a terrible, liberating rage. That night, sleep was a country I couldn't enter. The house, usually a silent tomb, seemed to come alive around me. It groaned and settled the old timbers, sighing under the weight of a history I was only just beginning to understand. It wasn't the wind. It was a chorus of secrets. I lay in the vast, cold bed I had shared with Robert for 50 years, the space beside me an unnerving, empty landscape. My mind, instead of drifting into slumber, raced backward, sifting through the archives of my memory, re-examining evidence I had long ago filed away as irrelevant. And one memory in particular surfaced with a chilling, unwelcome clarity. It was from about 30 years ago. We were living in our quiet, obscenely wealthy suburb of Oak Creek, Illinois, a place where the lawns were manicured, the cars were foreign, and the secrets were buried deep. Robert had just finished the plans for this house, his masterpiece, and he was obsessed, absolutely consumed with the basement. Soundproofing, he had said, standing over the blueprints spread across our old dining table. He'd tapped a thick finger on the section marked sub-level. He'd given me a smile, then one of his signature smiles that was all teeth and no warmth, a smile that never ever reached his cold, calculating eyes. For my workshop. A man needs his hobbies, Elizabeth. A place to unwind. A hobby. I had accepted it, of course. A wife of my generation, of my social standing, did not question her husband. Especially not a husband like Robert Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms and city councils with the same iron will he used to command his own household. But I was never allowed down there. Not once. While the rest of the house was my domain to manage to decorate within his strict parameters, to keep polished and perfect for his entertaining, the basement was his sanctum, his alone. He had a separate, heavy-gauge, steel-reinforced door installed at the top of the basement stairs, a door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault, not in a residential home. It had a complex keypad lock, a series of numbers only he knew. Privacy, my dear, he'd explained, when I'd asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Every man needs a little privacy. Over the years, the privacy of that room became an unbreachable wall in our marriage. Sometimes strange smells would drift up from beneath the floorboards, seeping through the cracks around that formidable door. They were acrid, chemical smells. Sometimes sharp and metallic, like burnt wiring. Other times they were astringent clean, like an industrial cleaning agent so strong they made my eyes water. When I dared to mention it, wrinkling my nose, he would wave a dismissive, impatient hand. Chemicals, Elizabeth. For my metalwork. Metalwork. What metalwork? I never saw any sculptures, any creations. The only things he ever worked on were stock portfolios and business deals. But I let it go. I packed the questions away alongside my own dreams, my own identity. I accepted his explanation because the alternative was too frightening to consider. Now, sitting up in the suffocating darkness of my bedroom, the silence of the house pressing in on me, that memory felt different. It was no longer a benign eccentricity. It felt sinister. The soundproofing, the steel door, the keypad lock, the chemical smells. It wasn't a workshop. It was a containment cell. My mind, newly sharpened by Chloe's venom and David's betrayal, started connecting things. Robert's obsession with privacy. His frequent, unexplained late nights spent working in the basement. The way he would sometimes emerge, his clothes smelling faintly of smoke and something else, something I could never quite place, something organic and unpleasant. I had spent 50 years believing this house, this fortress of wealth and power, was built to protect me, to elevate me. A gilded cage, yes, but a cage nonetheless designed for my safety. But what if I was wrong? What if I had been the secondary prisoner? What if the house wasn't built to protect me at all? What if it was built to imprison something else entirely? A dark, monstrous secret locked away right beneath my feet. And I, as silent, obedient wife, had been its unwitting guard for 3 decades. The cold dread that washed over me was more real, more visceral than any grief I was supposed to feel for my dead husband. I was alone in a mausoleum, and I was suddenly terrifyingly certain that the monster wasn't the man in the grave. The monster was the legacy he had left behind. The silence in the house had become a physical presence in the days following the funeral. It was a heavy blanket, smelling of dust and dried lilies, a silence Robert had cultivated, and which I had learned to wear like a second skin. It was a week later, a Tuesday, I think, when the quiet was finally broken. Not by a voice, but by the crisp, tearing sound of an envelope. It had arrived with the morning mail, a thick, cream-coloured rectangle that felt heavy and self-important in my hand. The return address was printed in sharp, embossed letters, Sterling Finch and Associates. Finch had been Robert's lawyer for decades, a man with a smile as thin as a razor cut. But the first name, Sterling, David. He hadn't just consulted a lawyer, he had made himself a partner in my dismantling. My hands trembled slightly as I slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener from Robert's desk, one of the 1,000 impersonal, expensive objects that populated my life. The paper inside was just as thick, just as arrogant. I didn't need to read far. The legal jargon jumped out sharp and hostile. Words like petition for conservatorship, fiduciary duty, and incompetence. They were citing my advanced age and recent emotional trauma, the grief of losing the man who had imprisoned me, as grounds for me being unfit to manage my own affairs. Specifically, the complexities of the Sterling estate. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a legal declaration of war. They were trying to have me erased, to have me declared a non-person in my own life, a senile old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own money, her own home. The audacity of it was a physical shock, like a slap. It stole the air from my lungs. I sank into the armchair by the window, the letter crinkling in my fist. I looked out at the manicured lawn, at the perfect, sterile garden Robert had designed. A garden I was never allowed to touch. For 50 years I had been silent. I had endured the condescension, the casual cruelties, the gilded cage Robert had built around me. I had perfected the art of being invisible, of absorbing insults and injuries without a ripple on the surface. My silence had been my shield, my survival mechanism, and they, my son and his grasping wife, had mistaken it for weakness. They saw my endurance and called it frailty. They looked at my grief and saw an opportunity. It was the same mistake Robert had made right up to the end. He believed my silence meant acceptance. But as I sat there clutching that insulting piece of paper, something shifted inside me. The years of quiet resentment, the banked embers of anger I had so carefully smothered began to glow. A flicker, then a spark, then a hot, pure, unadulterated rage that felt cleaner and more honest than anything I had felt in decades. It burned away the fog of grief and resignation. It was a feeling of profound, terrible clarity. They had drawn the battle lines. They thought they were attacking a ghost, a relic. They were about to find out they had woken something else entirely. My eyes scanned the room, this monument to Robert's ego. The oil paintings of ships he'd never sailed, the mahogany desk he'd used to sign deals that made other men disappear, the oppressive stillness. This wasn't just a house. It was the scene of a crime, a 50-year-long crime of the soul. And they wanted to inherit it, all the bricks, the money, and the cruelty that came with it. I smoothed the letter out on my lap. I read it again, slowly, letting each word fuel the fire inside me. Unfit to manage, cognitive decline, protecting her best interests. The lies were so bald, so transparently self-serving. They weren't protecting me. They were caging me so they could pick the carcass of the estate clean. I folded the letter neatly, placed it on the side table, and stood up. The tremor in my hands was gone, replaced by a steady calm. I walked over to the telephone, a heavy, old-fashioned rotary phone on a carved stand. Its weight felt solid, real. I knew who I had to call. There was only one person in this family who had ever looked at me and seen a person, not a placeholder. The only one whose eyes weren't clouded by the golden glare of the sterling inheritance. I picked up the receiver, the cool plastic familiar against my ear, and dialed the number from memory. I was calling my grandson, Leo. Leo arrived less than an hour later. I heard the faint electric whine of his scooter coming up the long, curved driveway long before I saw him. He cut the engine at the stone steps and came to the door, a tall, lanky 17-year-old swallowed by a dark grey hoodie, his face shadowed by the brim. He was a stark contrast to the polished, predatory brightness of his parents. Where David and Chloe were loud, Leo was quiet. Where they were performative, he was observant. He lived more in the digital ether of his phone and his laptop than in the loud, brittle world his parents were so desperate to conquer. I opened the door before he could knock. He looked up, his eyes so much like my own, taking in my face. He didn't offer a hollow, "How are you, Grandma?" or any of the other useless pleasantries. He was direct, his voice low and certain. "They're trying to put you in a home and sell the house, aren't they?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I just nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the grand foyer, his sneakers silent on the marble floor. He looked around, not with awe or appreciation like most visitors, but with a kind of clinical distaste, as if he were seeing it for what it was, a museum of unhappiness. "How did you know?" I asked, my voice a little rough. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glowing in the dim light of the hall. "I don't snoop," he said, as if to preempt an accusation. But Dad's logged into the family account on my computer. I saw his Zillow browsing history. And Mum's not exactly subtle. He tapped the screen and held the phone out to me. There it was. An Instagram account, Chloe's public one, filled with pictures of her smiling at charity galas and holding champagne flutes. But he had navigated to a series of saved posts, a collection she had curated. He called it a mood board. The title she'd given it was Project Penthouse. I took the phone. My fingers, accustomed to the weight of old books and teacups, felt clumsy on the sleek glass. I scrolled. There were images of a sterile, glass-walled apartment overlooking a city skyline. White leather sofas, chrome fixtures, a kitchen that looked like it had never seen a hot meal. And there, superimposed onto some of the images, was Chloe. She was posing, smiling a triumphant, hungry smile in these mock-ups of a life she hadn't yet acquired. The captions were nauseating. Hashtags like "Shot New Beginnings," "Shook Future Home," and most gallingly, "Sterling Legacy." She was selling my home, my life, before she even owned it, and using my husband's name, our name, to brand her avarice. A hot flush of humiliation burned up my neck. It was so cheap, so public. To be discarded and have your legacy simultaneously co-opted for a social media campaign. It was a uniquely modern form of cruelty. I handed the phone back to Leo. He saw the look on my face and quickly put it away. "They're moving fast," he said. "They had a realtor over last week. Told me it was for an insurance appraisal. I knew they were lying. They sent a letter." I said, my voice now steady, the rage having cooled into something harder, something more useful. From their lawyer, their petitioning for conservatorship, Leo's face tightened. The teenage apathy fell away, replaced by a flicker of his mother's sharpness, but directed at her, not me. To have you declared incompetent, so they can control everything without your signature. That's Finch's move. He's a shark. He paused. What are you going to do? I looked at him, really looked at him. This quiet boy who saw everything. He wasn't a child anymore. He was an ally. An unlikely one, but perhaps the only one I had. I need your help, Leo, I said. My voice was low, conspiratorial. It felt strange to speak this way in my own home. Your grandfather. He had a workshop in the basement. He built it 30 years ago. A special room. Leo nodded. The one with the big steel door. Yeah, Dad said Grandpa kept his old tools and models in there. Said it was soundproofed so he wouldn't bother you. A bitter laugh almost escaped me. He said that to everyone. The truth is, I've never been inside. He put a keypad lock on it. He told me it was private. His sanctuary. You want me to try and get it open? Leo's eyes lit up with a spark of technical curiosity, a challenge. I need to get in. I repeated, the urgency clear in my voice. I need to know what he was hiding in there. We went down the main staircase, and then down a second, narrower flight of stairs to the basement. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp stone and thyme. Most of the basement was a sprawling, unfinished space filled with forgotten furniture under white sheets, like a graveyard of domestic life. But at the far end it was different. Robert had had a section walled off, and in that wall was the door. It was even more formidable than I remembered. A thick, grey steel door, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a bunker. It was flush with the concrete wall, seamless and impenetrable. And next to the heavy handle was a small brass-coloured digital keypad, its buttons worn smooth from use. Leo walked up to it and ran his hand over the cold steel. Wow, he murmured. Grandpa wasn't kidding around. He looked from the door back to me. In the dim light of the single bare bulb, he could see it on my face. The desperation, the fear, the silent plea that spanned decades of unanswered questions. Okay, he said, his voice all business now. He pulled a small, sleek black device from his backpack, something that looked like a high-tech multi-tool, and peered at the keypad. It's old, he mused, tapping a few of the buttons. They made no sound. No feedback, probably a simple 4-digit code. No lockout mechanism, which is good. We can just keep trying. He looked at me. What are the obvious ones? Dad's birthday, August 4th, I said. 080 till 4. Leo typed it in. Nothing. A small red light on the keypad blinked once, impassively. Mom's birthday, May 20th, 0520. Nothing. Your birthday, January 12th, 0112. Nothing. We spent the next 20 minutes trying everything. Their wedding anniversary, the year this house was built, the street address, Robert's birthday, my birthday, the last 4 digits of his old phone number. Each attempt was met with the same silent, solitary red blink. The door remained a silent, stubborn sentinel guarding its secrets. Leo sat back on his heels, frustrated. It's not any of the family stuff. He must have used something else. A number that meant something only to him. He sighed. It could be anything. We could be here for days. I leaned against the cool concrete wall, my mind racing, sifting through the dusty archives of my memory. A number that meant something only to him. Business. It was always about business. His partners, his deals, his victories. I thought about the early years when Sterling Industries was just getting started. I thought about the men who had come and gone, the rivals who had suddenly folded, the partners who had been bought out, And then a memory surfaced cold and sharp as a shard of ice. A name. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy had been Robert's first real business partner, a cheerful, portly man with a booming laugh. They had built the company together. And then one day, he was just gone. Robert had come home and announced that Abernathy had decided to retire to sell his shares and move to Florida for his health. It had all been very sudden. I remembered thinking it was strange. His wife had seemed bewildered when I'd seen her at the market a few weeks later. She said she hadn't even known he was unwell. I remembered the year, 1989. And I remembered the talk, the whispers among the other wives. Abernathy hadn't just retired. He had vanished. He'd left his office one afternoon and never made it home. His car was found a week later in a long-term parking lot at the airport. But there was no record of him ever buying a ticket, ever boarding a flight. He was just gone. The police investigated. Nothing ever came of it. Robert had been terribly publicly distraught. But in private, I remembered a new stillness in him. A cold, satisfied calm. A dreadful, icy certainty washed over me. The soundproofing. The secrets. The disappearance. Leo, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Try the date. The date his first partner, Mr. Abernathy, disappeared. Leo looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. Abernathy. Who's that? It doesn't matter. Just try the date. January 1st, 1989. Leo's fingers hovered over the keypad, a look of dawning comprehension and horror on his face. He understood the implication. Slowly, deliberately, he typed in the 4 digits, 1189. For a moment, nothing happened. The red light didn't even blink. I thought it was another failure. But then there was a sound. Not a beep, but a heavy mechanical thud from within the door. A deep, resonant clack. The lock had disengaged. The air that rolled out wasn't just cold. It was sterile, clinical. It hit me with the chemical sharpness of bleach and ammonia, an aggressive, clean smell that failed to mask something else underneath. A faint, acrid odor that was deeply primally wrong. Something burnt. Leo pushed the heavy steel door open. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing the room beyond. My breath caught in my throat. This was no workshop. There were no tool benches, no woodworking models, no comfortable clutter of a beloved hobby. The room was a cube of white, sterile tiles. The floor, the walls, even the ceiling. The floor was sloped slightly, leading to a large circular drain in the center, the kind you'd see in a butcher's shop or a surgical theater. The light was harsh, fluorescent, unforgiving. And in the center of the room, dominating the space, was the source of the faint, burnt smell. It was not a workbench. It was a massive stainless steel incinerator. It was state-of-the-art, the size of a small car, with a thick, insulated door and a complex control panel of dials and gauges. A huge insulated flue pipe rose from its top, running up and disappearing into the ceiling, feeding directly into the main chimney stack of the house. A custom installation. Robert had complained for months about the cost of relining the flue all those years ago. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This wasn't for medical waste. It was bigger. Much bigger. It was an industrial disposal unit designed for absolute high-temperature destruction. Leo let out a choked sound beside me. What is this? I couldn't answer. I stepped into the room, my sensible shoes squeaking on the pristine tile. Along one wall were tall metal lockers. I pulled one open. It was filled with cleaning supplies. Gallon jugs of industrial-strength bleach bottles of acid heavy-duty degreasers. The next locker held tools. Not hammers and saws. They were laid out neatly on foam backing scalpels, bone saws, heavy cleavers, and several sets of what looked disturbingly like surgical instruments. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. All of Robert's late nights, his sudden, unexplained business trips, the rivals who had abruptly retired, the partners who vanished without a trace, the politicians who suddenly dropped their opposition to his zoning requests. My husband wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a monster. This room wasn't a hobby space. It was a disposal facility, a place to make things and people disappear. This house, my home, wasn't a sanctuary. It was built on a foundation of secrets and bones. And then I saw it. On a small, tidy steel desk, tucked into a corner, almost an afterthought. It was a single leather-bound book, a ledger. I walked over to it, as if in a trance. My hand shook as I reached out and opened it. The handwriting inside was Robert's, meticulous, controlled, perfect. But this wasn't a ledger of finances, not in the traditional sense. The columns were labeled date, weight, LBS, initials, payment. My eyes scanned the page, entry after entry spanning 30 years. 101-189, 185, WA, $250,000, WA, William Abernathy. The next entry was from a year later, 3/15/90, 210, MR, $300,000, MR, Michael Romano, a union leader who had organized a strike at one of Robert's factories. The strike had collapsed after Romano disappeared. Police suspected a mob hit. It was a sterling hit. Page after page, a secret history of my husband's success. A litany of the disappeared. Each entry a life erased, converted into a neat column of numbers. I felt a wave of nausea, my hand flying to my mouth. I had slept next to this man for 50 years. I had raised his child. I had lived off the profits of this abattoir. I flipped to the last page. There was a final entry dated just 2 weeks before Robert's heart attack. The initials were unfamiliar, MT. The weight was recorded. But under the payment column, Robert's neat script had written a single word, pending. I closed the book. The heavy thud of the leather cover echoed in the tiled room. I finally understood. The inheritance. The legacy that David and Chloe were so desperate to claim, so eager to seize before I could get in the way. It wasn't just the house and the stocks and the investment portfolios. It was this grotesque, profitable, and still active business. A strange, terrifying calm settled over me. It was the calm of absolute certainty, the kind that comes when you realize the worst thing you can imagine is true. My entire life had not just been a lie, it had been an accessory to a nightmare. This house wasn't a gilded cage. It was a tomb. It was a monument to a man who was not just cruel, but pathologically evil. And Chloe's whisper at the funeral, the words that had been echoing in my mind for weeks, suddenly replayed with horrifying clarity. I have to rush off after this, darling. I'm putting a deposit down today. A deposit. I had thought it was for the penthouse for that soulless glass box in the city. I was wrong. My gaze fell to the ledger, to the last entry. MT payment pending. A deposit on a soul. They knew. David and Chloe. They knew what was in this room. They knew what this ledger represented. And they weren't just planning to sell the house. They were planning to continue the family business. The pending client was their first transaction. They were stepping into Robert's blood-soaked shoes. My son. My own son was preparing to become a killer for hire just like his father. The sterling legacy. A storm raged inside me. A hurricane of guilt, horror, and a lifetime of suppressed rage. One part of me, the part that had been a wife and mother for 50 years, screamed to take the ledger, to walk over to that monstrous incinerator and to throw it inside. To burn the evidence, to erase this horror from my family's history, to protect the name, to protect what was left of my son. But another part of me, a part that had been silent for too long, the part of me that had just been reawakened by that insulting legal letter, screamed for justice. Not for me. Not anymore. For them. for WA, for MR, for all the initials in that ghastly book, for the final pending victim MT, whoever they were. The silence I had kept for half a century had been a form of complicity. I wouldn't be silent anymore. I looked over at Leo. He stood frozen by the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and revulsion. He was staring at the incinerator, his young mind trying to absorb the sheer monstrosity of it. He looked like he was going to be sick. He finally tore his gaze away and looked at me, his expression one of pure, unadulterated horror. "They can't," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. "Grandma, they can't get away with this." His fear, his innocence in the face of this absolute evil, it was the final catalyst. It solidified my resolve. They had threatened me. They had tried to erase me. But now they were threatening to poison him, to drag him into this legacy of filth. I would not allow it. I would burn the entire Sterling Empire to the ground before I let them corrupt him too. I walked over and gently took the ledger from the desk. I held it to my chest. It felt cold, heavy. The weight of sins. "No," I said, and my voice was not the voice of a frail, grieving widow. It was hard as the steel of the door, as cold as the tile on the floor. It was the voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose and a world of justice to gain. I looked straight into my grandson's terrified eyes, and I made him a promise. They won't. They want the Sterling legacy, they're going to get it. Every last bit of it. My plan wasn't born in a flash of inspiration. It grew slowly, a poisonous vine twisting its way up from the dark soil of the basement, its tendrils wrapping around the foundations of my life. It was a horrifying plan, built from pieces of my past, my husband's sins, and my children's greed. To dismantle the prison Robert had built, I had to use his own tools, deception, manipulation, and an intimate understanding of human weakness. And my children, I knew, were profoundly, fatally weak. Leo became my hands and my eyes in a world I barely understood. He sat beside me in the dim light of the study, his laptop glowing a silent portal into the lives David and Chloe thought were private. It didn't take him long. David, my brilliant son, the one who was supposed to be a titan like his father, was drowning. A tech venture launched with more arrogance than capital had imploded months ago. He was hemorrhaging money, desperate to find a lifeline before his creditors and investors realized the ship had already sunk. Chloe was a different kind of disaster. Her life, curated for the envious eyes of strangers on Instagram and TikTok, was a shimmering facade built on a mountain of debt. The designer clothes, the exclusive spa days, the casual mentions of trips they couldn't afford, it was all financed by credit cards pushed to their absolute limits. They weren't just greedy. They were cornered. They needed a miracle, a sudden massive influx of cash. And I was going to give it to them. I picked up the phone, my hand steady my heart, a cold, hard stone in my chest. I rehearsed the quaver in my voice, the hesitation, the sound of a woman broken. I dialed David's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice clipped and impatient. "Mom, is everything all right?" "David." I began letting my voice crack just so. I pictured my reflection in the polished surface of Robert's desk, a grieving widow, frail and lost. "I've been thinking about what you said." I paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to fill it. "About the assisted living community?" he asked a little too quickly. "It's a great place, Mum. Top-of-the-line care." "No, not that." I sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "About the house. You're right." I let a small, pathetic sob catch in my throat. It was a performance worthy of the stage. It's just too much for me. All these rooms, all these memories." I could almost feel his posture changing through the phone, the hunter, sensing his prey, was giving up the fight. In the background, I heard Chloe's sharp whisper. What's she saying? Is she agreeing? Let's just get it over with. I whispered into the phone. Sell it. Do what you have to do. A moment of stunned silence. Then David, trying to sound sympathetic, but failing miserably. Mum, I know this is hard, but I really think it's for the best. We can get it on the market next week. Have an open house? No. I cut him off my voice, regaining a sliver of its old command, before I softened it again. No open houses. No signs on the lawn. I can't bear the thought of strangers walking through Robert's home. I let that sink in, appealing to the twisted sense of legacy he'd inherited from his father. I've found someone. A private buyer. A buyer. David's voice sharpened the scent of money, overriding any pretense of concern. Who, how? An old acquaintance of your father's? I lied smoothly. He's a reclusive investor. Very private. He heard about Robert and reached out to offer his condolences. We got to talking. He wants a quick off-market sale. All cash. To avoid publicity, you understand. Cash. I could hear Chloe gasp in the background. The word hung in the air, shimmering with promise. How much, Mom? David asked, his voice low and tense. I took a breath. This was the hook. I named a figure so outrageously, ludicrously high that it would have been laughable in any sane negotiation. It was a number designed to short-circuit their reason, to ignite their greed, until it burned away any shred of caution. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could picture their faces, the shock, the dawning, rapturous belief. I heard Chloe's frantic, muffled whisper, "Oh my God, David, oh my God. Is he serious?" David finally managed to stammer. Completely. I said, my voice now calm and businesslike. He considers it a fair price for the property and for the discretion. But he wants to finalize the deal in person, at the house. Of course, whatever he wants. David said, his voice thick with avarice. When he's a busy man, he can make time tomorrow night, I said. He wants it to be simple. Just us and him. No lawyers, no agents. Not yet. He said it keeps things cleaner. He'll bring the certified papers himself. Tomorrow night, David repeated, his voice a daze. Yes, we'll be there. How good? I said, letting the weary, grieving mother persona fall back into place. I'll see you then, dear. I need to go lie down. I hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a quiet, definitive click. The house was silent. The first piece of the trap was set. The reclusive investor, of course, did not exist. He was a ghost I had conjured from their own desperate fantasies. The real guest of honor was someone else entirely, someone they could never imagine. The hours that followed were a blur of focused intensity. Leo and I descended into the dark heart of Robert's ledger. The basement felt miles away. The real horror was here on the glowing screen of Leo's laptop. The neat columns of dates, initials, and figures were no longer just abstract symbols. They were ghosts. With Leo's frighteningly adept skills, we began to cross-reference the entries with the vast, morbid archives of the internet. We dove into cold case files, old news articles about business rivals who had suffered sudden, catastrophic misfortunes, and forum posts from families still searching for loved ones who had vanished without a trace. It was like excavating a mass grave. Each potential link was a fresh wave of nausea. MP 1995, a union organizer who had been a thorn in the side of one of Robert's construction projects. He disappeared after his car was found abandoned near Lake Michigan. GL 2003. A city inspector who had threatened to halt a major development over safety violations. He vanished 2 days before he was due to testify. The list went on a secret history of my husband's empire written in blood and ash. We focused on the final entry, the one marked pending. The initials were MT. The date was recent, just before Robert's death. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the screen, a grim-faced oracle deciphering a cursed text. Marcus Thorne, he said, his voice low. He pulled up an article from a Chicago-based investigative journal. The headline read, "Local journalist investigating corporate corruption missing for 2 weeks." The face that stared back at me from the screen was young, determined, with eyes that held a spark of defiance. Marcus Thorne had been digging into a web of shell corporations and backroom deals involving some of the city's most powerful figures. His last known project was an exposé on how certain developers bypassed environmental regulations. Developers like Robert Sterling. My blood ran cold. The pending entry wasn't an old debt. It was an open contract, a job left unfinished, a life left in limbo. David and Chloe weren't just planning to take over the house. They were planning to take over the family business. We have to find his family. I said, my voice barely a whisper. Leo was already there. He has a sister, he said, his expression grim. Isabella Thorne. He clicked, and a new profile appeared on the screen. It was a photo from a police department website. A woman with the same determined eyes as her brother, her hair pulled back severely, her face a mask of professional composure. Detective Isabella Thorne, Chicago PD Homicide Division, a relentless, decorated detective known for closing impossible cases. A terrible, perfect symmetry began to lock into place. She was a hunter who had lost her own. For weeks, maybe months, she had been searching, hitting dead ends, fighting against a wall of silence and power. I had what she was looking for. I had the prey, but contacting a police detective was a monumental risk. A single misstep, and the whole thing could collapse. They could swarm the house, seize the ledger, and my chance to control the narrative would be gone. David and Chloe would lawyer up, paint me as a senile, grieving old woman, and the truth would be buried under a mountain of legal maneuvers. I had to bring her here on my terms. Alone. Leo. I said, my voice firm, the last of my hesitation burning away. I need you to send an email. It has to be completely anonymous. Untraceable. He nodded, his eyes fixed on mine, understanding the weight of the moment. What do you want it to say? I thought for a moment, choosing the words as carefully as a surgeon chooses a scalpel. They had to be bait. She couldn't resist. They had to speak to the part of her that was a sister, not just a cop. Just a date, a time, an address? My address? I paused. And one line. Come alone if you want to know what happened to your brother. Leo's fingers typed the clicks, echoing in the silent study. He routed the message through a series of encrypted servers, a ghost in the machine, speaking to a ghost hunter. He hit send. The message vanished into the digital ether. There was no taking it back. I had thrown the stone into the water. Now all I could do was wait for the ripples. My gut, an instrument, honed by 50 years of deciphering Robert's moods, his rages and his silences, told me she would come. A professional might have brought backup, followed protocol. But a sister offered the one thing she craved most in the world. She would honor the request. She would come alone. The following evening, the house felt different. It was no longer a tomb or a prison. It was a stage meticulously set for a final performance. I had spent the day preparing not with dusting and polishing, but with a cold, calculated precision. I moved through the rooms, seeing them not as spaces filled with memories, but as tactical positions. The lighting was low, the air still. A bottle of Robert's finest single malt scotch, a ridiculously expensive brand he reserved for closing major deals, sat on the mahogany bar cart, two crystal tumblers beside it. The bait. Leo was my silent stage manager. Earlier, he had planted tiny, powerful microphones throughout the formal living room, one tucked behind a landscape painting, another in a bowl of decorative ceramic orbs, a third beneath the lip of the marble mantelpiece. They were invisible, but they would be my audience, my witnesses. I heard their car pull into the driveway, the crunch of gravel, a sound of impending doom. I stood by the window in the study, peering through the blinds. David got out first, straightening his tie, his face a mask of strained anticipation. Then Chloe emerged, a vision, in a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my first car. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her eyes sweeping over the grand facade of the house, as if she were already measuring for new drapes. I met them at the door, my expression one of somber grace. "Did the investor transfer the escrow funds?" David asked immediately. "No. Hello, Mom. No. How are you holding up just the raw, naked hunger for money? He's bringing the certified papers in person." I said smoothly, my voice a calm lake over a churning sea. "He values the personal touch." I gestured for them to come in. He should be here any moment. I led them into the formal living room, the heart of the web. "My God, this room has such good bones," Chloe said, running a hand over the back of a silk brocade sofa. "But it's so dated. I was looking at some Italian marble for the new bathroom in the penthouse. I think the same vein would be just stunning for the fireplace here, a complete remodel." She spoke as if I wasn't there, as if I were a ghost already. They settled on the sofa, a king and queen surveying a kingdom they believed was already theirs. "A drink while we wait?" I offered, moving toward the bar cart. "A celebratory glass of your father's scotch." Their eyes lit up. "Don't mind if I do," David said, a grin finally breaking through his tense facade. Chloe nodded eagerly. I poured two generous glasses, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. My hands were perfectly steady. As I handed them their drinks, I felt a vibration from the small phone in my pocket. A single, silent buzz. It was the signal from Leo. He was hidden in the upstairs office, his laptop, open, his fingers poised over the keyboard. The final step was in motion. He activated the microphones. In the digital ether, a live stream flickered to life on a throwaway Twitch account he'd created. The stream had no video, only the crystal-clear audio from the living room. At the same moment, an automated blast of emails and direct messages shot out from another of Leo's ghost accounts. The link to the stream, along with a single tantalizing subject line, was sent to a curated list, every major news outlet in Chicago, a handful of high-ranking contacts within the police department, and most deliciously, the thousands of avid social media followers who hung on Chloe Sterling's every post. The title of the stream was simple, brutal, and perfect: The Sterling Legacy, a Live Confession. I watched them take their first sip of scotch. Chloe swirled the glass, a connoisseur of things she hadn't earned. David took a deep gulp, the relief washing over his face. They were so close. They could taste it. They had no idea that hundreds, perhaps thousands of people were now listening to the quiet clinking of their glasses, waiting for the show to begin. The doorbell rang. The chime cut through the quiet hum of their anticipation, sharp and clear. David and Chloe both jumped slightly, their faces turning to the hallway, their eyes gleaming with greed. The main event had arrived. "I'll get it," I said, my voice even. David started to rise. "Shouldn't I? It's the investor." "No," I said, placing a hand gently on his arm, a gesture of maternal control that was really a command. "You stay here. Make a good impression." He settled back onto the sofa, mollified. Chloe smoothed her pantsuit, a predatory smile playing on her lips. They looked like two sleek wolves, waiting for the farmer to hand over the keys to the henhouse. I walked down the long, cool marble hallway. Every step was deliberate. This was the point of no return. I opened the heavy oak door. It wasn't a fictional reclusive billionaire. It was a woman in a simple dark pantsuit and a plain white blouse. Her face was a granite mask of controlled fury, her eyes boring into mine, searching. She was exactly as she had appeared in her photograph, but in person, the intensity was a physical force. Detective Isabella Thorne. She held up her badge briefly, a flash of gold, in the dim light of the porch, before letting it fall. She was alone. "I'm here about my brother," she said, her voice low and steady, a string pulled taut. "I know," I replied and stepped back to let her in. I led her into the living room. David and Chloe were on their feet, their smiles of welcome freezing on their faces as they saw not a wealthy old man, but a severe, unsmiling woman who radiated an authority that had nothing to do with money. "Who is this?" Chloe snapped, her voice sharp with confusion and annoyance. The illusion was faltering. "Our buyer is running a little late," I said. My voice didn't tremble. It didn't waver. It rang with a power that silenced the room, a power that had been dormant for 50 years. But I thought while we wait, we could discuss the other family business. I turned my gaze from Chloe and locked it onto my son. His face, which had been flushed with triumph, was starting to pale. The one in the basement. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. Chloe let out a short, nervous laugh. "Mom, what are you talking about? Are you feeling all right?" I ignored her. My focus was entirely on David. "Tell me, son, the pending entry in your father's ledger, the one for MT Marcus Thorne." His name hung in the air like poison. David's face went from pale to stark white. He looked like he'd been struck. "Were you planning on finishing the job? Was that your audition to prove you were a worthy successor to your father? This is insane." Chloe blustered, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "Mom, your grief is making you delusional, David. What is she saying?" But David was speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was staring at me as if he'd never seen me before. I continued, my voice cold and clear, for the hidden microphones, for the invisible audience leaning in to listen. "And you, Chloe." I turned to her, and she flinched. "Your deposit? You were so excited about it. Was it really for the penthouse? Or was it a down payment from the people who hired my husband, and by extension, my son, to make a journalist disappear? You're crazy." She spat, her eyes darting between me and the silent, watchful detective. "You're a sick old woman." Just then, a quiet hum filled the room as the large smart TV on the wall flickered to life. An image appeared, stark and horrifyingly clear, projected for all to see. It was a high-resolution photograph Leo had taken. The incinerator. The cold, industrial steel, the heavy-duty latch, the dark maw of the furnace door. A silent testament to the room beneath our feet. Chloe's tirade died in her throat. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her face a canvas of dawning horror. David made a small, strangled sound. Isabella Thorne took one slow step forward. Her hand came to rest on her hip near the concealed shape of her service weapon. Her gaze never left my children. "David and Chloe Sterling," she said, and her voice was like ice cracking over a deep, dark lake. "My name is Detective Isabella Thorne, and I have a few questions for you about the disappearance of my brother." The name, the title, the image on the screen. It was a trinity of damnation. Chloe stared at the monstrous furnace, then at the detective. Then finally her eyes landed on me. The mask of chic superiority, the one she had so carefully constructed for her followers and for the world, didn't just crack. It shattered. It fell away to reveal the terrified, grasping, greedy creature beneath. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the full, undiluted terror of being caught. The show was over. The lights had come up, and there was nowhere left for them to hide. The silence that fell after the chaos was louder than any scream. One moment my living room was a stage for a grand, terrible opera of flashing lights, sharp commands, and the final pathetic crumbling of my son. The next, it was just me, the grandfather clock ticking in the hall, and the ghost of red and blue light still painting the walls long after the cruisers had pulled away. They were gone. David, his face a mask of infantile terror, confessing to everything before they even had him properly in the car. Chloe, spitting denials like a cornered cat, her lies thin and brittle against the mountain of evidence we had built. I had watched them being led away, my face a carefully composed mask of a grieving widow, a shocked mother. Inside there was nothing, not triumph, not relief. Just a vast, hollow space where a mother's love for her son used to be. I had won. I had brought the entire rotten structure of Robert's legacy crashing down. But victory felt like standing in the rubble of my own life. I had sacrificed my own child on the altar of justice. It was a necessary amputation, a desperate measure to save the rest of the body from a creeping gangrene. But the phantom limb ached. It ached with the memory of a little boy with skinned knees and a trusting smile, a boy who loved the stories I read to him before bed, a boy who existed long before his father's poison seeped into his bones and remade him into a monster. Leo came downstairs after the last of the uniforms had left. He didn't say anything. He just came over to the wing-back chair where I sat, still and silent as a statue, and put a blanket over my shoulders. His touch was gentle, tentative. He was only 17, and he had just helped orchestrate the complete destruction of his own parents. What could he possibly say? What could I? We sat there together, in the echoing silence of the monument, the air thick with unspoken things. The next morning, the firestorm broke. It was exactly as Leo had predicted, only 1,000 times more intense. Our quiet, tree-lined street was choked with news vans, their satellite dishes aimed at my house like weapons. Reporters with impossibly white teeth and hungry eyes camped out on the sidewalk shouting questions whenever a curtain twitched. Leo became my gatekeeper, my shield. He unplugged the landline which had begun to ring with a relentless, shrieking hysteria. He showed me his phone just once so I would understand. Sterling Legacy is trending #1 worldwide, he said, his voice flat. He scrolled through the feed. A torrent of digital fury and fascination. The live stream, raw and unedited, had been viewed millions of times. My face old and lined. David's slack with dawning horror. Chloe's contorted in greedy anticipation. And then the final damning images of the incinerator. The ledger, the arrival of Detective Thorne. It was a perfectly packaged nightmare consumed by a global audience. There were screen grabs with cruel captions, memes of Chloe's face morphing into a $sign, armchair psychologists analyzing my family dynamics in 2,000-word threads. Some called me a hero, a badass grandmother taking back her power. Others called me a monster, a modern-day Medea who had sacrificed her own children. They were all right. And they were all wrong. "Turn it off, Leo," I said, my voice raspy. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't see my private agony turned into public entertainment. He did. For the next few days, we lived in a self-imposed isolation. He managed the groceries, slipping out a back way in the pre-dawn hours. I moved through the house like a ghost, unable to settle. Every room was a memory now tainted. The dining room where we'd had so many tense, silent family dinners. The study Robert's domain where the plan for this dynasty of death was likely born. I found myself staring at a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. David, age 5 or 6, holding up a finger, painting his face, beaming with pride. I had taken that picture. I remembered the smell of the cheap paint, the warmth of his small hand in mine. Where did that boy go? When did the light in his eyes die out, replaced by the dull gleam of avarice? The news of David's confession came via a sober-faced anchor on the evening news, the volume kept low by Leo. In his weakness, in his terror of facing the consequences alone, he had given them everything. He didn't just implicate himself and Chloe. He sang a song of his father's sins, naming names that stretched back decades. Powerful men, politicians, financiers, men who moved in the highest circles of society, all of them clients of Robert Sterling's discreet disposal service. Chloe, they said, had tried to maintain her innocence, weaving a frantic, pathetic story about being manipulated, about having no idea. But the evidence was a steel trap. The ledger, with its cold, meticulous accounting of death. The forensics from the basement. And now her husband's own testimony. The trap had snapped shut. They were denied bail. The charges were staggering. Conspiracy accessory to multiple homicides, illegal disposal of human remains. The story of my husband, the respected businessman, was being rewritten in real time, his legacy transformed from one of shrewd success to one of monstrous depravity. And I was the author of that final chapter. I felt a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't guilt. It was resolution. The necessary brutal work was done. The day the forensics teams arrived in force felt like a new kind of invasion. But this one was cleansing. The police tape went up a yellow scar across my front door, officially declaring my home a crime scene. For weeks, it was no longer my own. It belonged to the investigation. Men and women in white Tyvek suits swarmed through the house, their movements methodical and quiet. They were like priests, performing a strange scientific exorcism. I was relegated to the upstairs rooms, listening to the muffled sounds of their work. They started in the basement. I heard the grinding of metal saws, the heavy thud of machinery being dismantled. They were taking it apart, piece by piece. The incinerator. Robert's final blasphemous altar. They tore out the sterile tile, tested the drains, scraped samples from the concrete floor beneath. They dug up sections of the garden, sifting the soil Robert had been so proud of, searching for bone fragments, for any trace of the lives that had ended here. They stripped the basement bare until it was nothing more than a concrete box, raw and exposed. They were erasing him. They were peeling back the layers of my prison, revealing the simple, honest structure beneath. During this time, the legal world began to circle. Not the sharks my son had hired, but different creatures entirely. One afternoon, Leo brought a woman to the house. She had to be cleared by the officer at the door. Her name was Anya Sharma. She was a lawyer, but not the kind I expected. She was young, dressed in a sharp black suit, with eyes that were intelligent and fiercely alive. She wasn't here to bill me by the hour. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, shaking my hand. Her grip was firm. "My firm would like to offer our services." "Pro bono. We've been following your case." "What you did?" It was extraordinary. I was suspicious. I had spent 50 years being wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. Why, I asked, my voice flat. Anya smiled, a quick, genuine flash of warmth. "Let's just say some of us believe in balancing the scales. The men your husband served? Some of them have been our opponents for years. They've ruined lives with their financial schemes, their political corruption. You've handed the justice system a key to unlock decades of filth, helping you secure your own life, your own assets from the wreckage. It feels like the right thing to do. It's a way of saying thank you." I looked at her, truly looked at her. I saw no pity in her eyes. I saw respect. I saw a fellow warrior. For the first time since this began, I felt a flicker of something other than emptiness. A connection. "All right, Ms. Sharma," I said. "Let's talk." The legal battles were immense, a tangled web of criminal and civil proceedings. The state was moving to seize all assets connected to the criminal enterprise. That was nearly everything. The stocks, the offshore accounts, the labyrinth of shell corporations Robert had built. Anya was brilliant. She argued forcefully and eloquently that I was not a beneficiary of a criminal empire, but its longest-held captive. I was the key witness, the one who had brought the whole house of cards down. My testimony was invaluable. We spent hours in the library, which had been cleared by forensics. I sat with Anya, going over decades of financial records I had never been allowed to see. She explained the complex dance of money, laundering the way Robert had woven the blood money into the fabric of his legitimate businesses. She helped me isolate what was truly mine, the inheritance from my own parents, which Robert had controlled but never fully absorbed. The house itself, which had been in my family long before he married me. The dirty money, the vast fortune built on death could be taken. I didn't want it. I wanted it gone. I wanted it burned away just like the bodies in the basement. Anya fought for me. She was a lioness. She shielded me from depositions that sought to paint me as complicit as a dotty old woman or as a vengeful wife. She built a fortress of legal protection around me, and within that fortress, I began to feel something other than a prisoner or a witness. I began to feel like a client, a person with rights, a woman with a future. The day the police finally left was quiet and unremarkable. The last detective, a tired-looking man who had been a fixture for weeks, gave me a small nod. "It's all yours now, ma'am," he said, pulling the last strip of yellow tape from the doorframe. He folded it neatly and put it in his pocket. Then he was gone. I closed the door. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden, profound silence. The house was mine, utterly and completely. I walked from room to room. The oppressive weight, the feeling of being watched by the very walls, was gone. Robert's presence had been scoured away, not just from the basement, but from the very air itself. The house no longer felt like his monument or my prison. It was just a structure of wood and stone filled with afternoon light waiting for a new purpose. My purpose. The seasons turned. The media storm dwindled to a drizzle, then to a few lingering puddles of online chatter. The trials would drag on for years, a distant hum of legal machinery chewing through the filth I had exposed. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't. It was my trophy earned at an unspeakable cost. It was my scar, a permanent reminder of the battle I had won. To sell it would be to dishonor the fight. Leo came to live with me. He couldn't go back. The home he had known was a crime scene, his parents' faces plastered across every tabloid. The shame was a heavy cloak, and he didn't know how to take it off. Here with me, we built a small island of quiet. We found a new, unspoken rhythm. He was a creature of the night, often awake when I was, and we'd sit in the kitchen drinking tea, the silence comfortable. He helped me navigate the modern world of online bill pay and streaming services. I taught him how to properly prune the roses in the garden, a skill my grandmother had taught me. We were two survivors patching together a new definition of family from the broken pieces of the old one. One morning, months later, when the first frost had silvered the lawn, I woke before dawn. It wasn't a nightmare that woke me or the phantom ache for a son I no longer had. It was a sense of peace, a stillness. I put on my robe and slippers, my footsteps soft on the wooden floors. On impulse, I didn't go to the kitchen for coffee. I went to the basement door. I hadn't been down there since the police had left. My hand hesitated on the knob. But there was no fear, only curiosity. I opened the door and flipped the switch. The bare bulb illuminated a clean, empty space. The air was cool and smelled of concrete and damp earth, nothing more. The floor was scrubbed clean. The walls were bare. The ugly drains had been filled in. There was no trace of the horror. It was just a basement, a cellar, a foundation. For the first time in 50 years standing in that space, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt the last final chain fall away. I felt free. I went back upstairs, out the back door, and into the garden. The air was cold and sharp, a clean shock to my lungs. The sun was just beginning to rise, a faint blush of rose and gold on the eastern horizon. The light caught the frost on the grass, making it sparkle like a field of diamonds. The world felt new, as if it had been washed clean. I knelt, the cold of the ground seeping through the thin fabric of my robe. I plunged my hands into the cool, dark earth. The soil felt rich and alive between my fingers. This was not the soil of a graveyard. It was the soil of a garden waiting to be planted. It felt like a beginning. My revenge was never just about exposing a crime or destroying the men who had wronged me. That was only the demolition. This was the rebuilding. It was about reclaiming the years, the light, the very air that had been stolen from me. I had survived the warden. I had torn down his monument brick by bloody brick. And now, in the quiet of my own private sunrise, under a sky that was mine and mine alone, I could finally begin to live. This is the end of my story, but it's the beginning of my life. A life I fought for. A life I earned. And it makes me wonder, what would you be willing to tear down to find your own sunrise? What monuments in your life need to be demolished? Let me know in the comments below. And thank you for listening.